Hi, everyone, and welcome to the monthly EAP update webinar. We're just letting audience members filter in, so we're going to watch those numbers climb up and welcome everybody. And if we could head to the next slide. As part of our community webinar series, branching off from the HEALEY ALS platform trial webinars, we're now doing a dedicated EAP or expanded access protocol discussion on the second Thursday of each month. So in line with that, we have arrived on the second Thursday of September, and we're so glad that you're here to join us. We have our wonderful host this evening, filling in for Dr. Paganoni, but I will leave it to Dr. Babu to introduce herself and the topic today.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. You go to the next slide. I'd like to start this webinar by thanking all our supporters for the EAP programs, and this list continues to grow, and it's really the community coming together to support expanded access protocols, which is wonderful to see. And I would be remiss if I don't thank all our participants in various different EAPs across different sites. Thank you so much for your support and participation in these programs. And we hope that these EAPs will continue to grow and offer access opportunities to experimental therapeutics in years to come. And move to the next slide. And one more slide. So today we'll give a broad overview of what EAPs are for those of you who are new to the space, and provide quick updates about two particular EAP studies that are ongoing, Pridopidine as well as the Rapa 501. Go to the next slide. And this is really our engine that drives all the EAP work on the back end. A big kudos to all our coordination center central teams, including our project management, data, systems, quality, admin, contracts, finance, and everybody that is working tirelessly on the back end to make these EAPs happen across multiple sites in the US. You can go to the next slide. So for those of you who are new to this space, what is an expanded access protocol? Sometimes this term is interchangeably used with the term compassionate use. There are some nuances between compassionate use and expanded access. But the FDA definition of EAPs EAP is really a pathway for a patient who has an immediately life-threatening or serious disease or condition where they can get access to an experimental or investigational medical product outside of clinical trials. So these are not clinical trials, but these are still experimental medical products or experimental drugs. So they're investigational, and this is particularly used as a pathway when no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy is available. You can go to the next slide. So in some ways, we mentioned that EAPs are not clinical trials, but they're also not clinical care because this is experimental therapeutic, and it's not an off-label, like taking a vitamin supplement. So it falls somewhere in that gray zone between research, clinical trials, and clinical care. It is still research. And so one way to think about EAPs is really as an extension of clinical care, where we bring in players in both realms, clinical care as well as research realm, and then try to kind of find a paradigm where we can actually provide access to experimental therapeutics for patients, but also follow all the research requirements, regulatory requirements that the FDA requires, and we maintain proper oversight of safety as well as the scientific integrity, because this is still experimental and this is an alternate pathway, which means that there is another pathway by which this particular drug, experimental drug, is being developed for ALS or for another indication. So whatever happens in this pathway potentially should not jeopardize the parent drug development pathway, which ultimately is the one that's going to go towards that finish line of getting FDA approval and becoming standard of care for everybody with ALS. Eventually. So we want to be sure that we follow research and regulatory requirements and protocols of the research realm. At the same time, we want to be mindful of patients who are enrolling in EAPs who tend to be folks who don't qualify for clinical trials. So many of EAP participants may be further along in their ALS journey, maybe having more a little bit more advanced illness, and may have more travel burden, may have other difficulties. So wherever possible, if we can try to combine with clinical visits or with clinical labs to minimize patient burden, to minimize travel burden, then that's sort of that amalgamation of the two realms. We can go to the next slide. So there are a number of considerations that go into deciding whether an EAP is appropriate along the drug development pathway for an experimental drug in ALS. And it's not an easy answer. And I've just tried to list a number of these considerations here, and I'm sure there are others that I haven't listed on the slide. So just to, at a very high level, when we think about, should we have an EAP while a drug is being developed and is in a clinical trial? I think the short answer, everybody, the knee jerk is to say, yes, of course we need to have an EAP because not everybody can be a part of the clinical trial. And this provides an opportunity for others who are not able to be a part of the trial to get access to an experimental drug. But then what are some of the other considerations as we think about heading in this direction? And why do we need this? It's not just for access, but when you think about the end game, let's say a drug goes through all the phases of testing, phase 1, 2, and 3, and it's successful, and a new drug application is filed, FDA approves the drug, it becomes standard of care. And when we get to insurers and when we seek insurance approvals for these medications, there could be a market gap, which means that the trial cohorts may not fully be representative of the generalized real world population who may actually want to get access to this therapy or could benefit from this. And many insurers may not cover medications for people who don't meet the trial criteria in terms of the clinical phenotype. And so this creates access problems for patients, but also creates business problems for companies who are trying to scale up new therapies that are approved. So that's a huge market gap. And the EAPs can fit really well in this case scenario to overcome some of these insurance barriers if it is done well and we collect real world data, both in terms of safety as well as in some of the EAPs, we can collect some clinical outcome measures as well, including some of the clinical functional measures or survival outcomes, and potentially this could provide additional supplemental data for overcoming some of the insurance barriers down the road. And the issue arises when we say, yeah, we have to provide access, and it has a number of these pluses. There is a huge demand and supply mismatch. It turns out that in ALS, only about 10 or so percentage of the ALS population can participate in clinical trials or they have access to clinical trials. So vast majority are still seeking access to experimental therapies and research. And can we provide, would it be feasible and practical to provide access to the 90% of ALS population through EAPs is an important question to think about. When you look at it from the drug developer's perspective, drug development is a very time-consuming and a very, very expensive process for manufacturing a drug and going through the phases of development from preclinical to phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. An average drug may take more than $40 million to actually, in terms of research and development spending costs, to get to that finish line. And many of these companies that are in ALS drug development space are small businesses. In order to fund a clinical trial, they have to raise a lot of capital to fund the phase 2, phase 3 studies. And on top of that, in order to gather more capital to fund EAPs may become a big barrier for a number of companies. And so that is a practical consideration. And especially in today's market, the economy is so tight, and many of the companies are struggling to raise capital to move the drug development forward for the parent drug. And so they may prioritize phase 2, phase 3 trials over EAPs. And then when you think about the regulatory pathway and, does this bring any risk to the drug development process when you're having EAPs? In many of the experimental conditions, some of them are already approved for a different indication, and now it's being tested for ALS, and there is already a lot of safety that's known about some of these experimental drugs. there could be other drugs where we don't know the safety of these products at all. It could be very early in drug development. It could be in phase 1. Maybe this is the parent trial is still in a first in human studies. And so we really don't know about the safety of some of these experimental drugs in the very early stages. And industry partners may actually be apprehensive about providing access via an expanded access for such drugs to people who are not in a trial, where the protocols and the oversight may be a little bit more flexible in an EAP compared to a traditional trials with fewer visits or remote visits built into it to add that flexibility. So it creates an oversight problem as well, and there could be some apprehension because of that. And then the last one is about the usability. And this is sort of like a push-pull scenario that happens among various different stakeholders, whether it's ALS clinics, patients, drug developers. On one hand, patients prefer to have less burdensome access to experimental therapeutics. Yeah, fewer visits, remote visits, fully paid visits, travel, reducing travel burden. And clinics, on the other hand, may have very limited staffing and bandwidth to support multiple different projects that are happening at the same time, including trials, EAPs, and they have to sort of prioritize and say, where do we put all our resources or many of our resources, and how do we divide our resources? What goes into the clinical trial bucket, what goes into observational biomarker research, what goes into EAPs, and so on and so forth. So, and then on the other hand, the drug manufacturer will want to make sure that, if you're providing access via EAP, no safety signals, adverse safety signals are missed from an EAP that could potentially throw a wrench in the overall drug development program for the parent drug that may currently be in a phase 2 or a phase 3 trial. So that's a push-pull scenario among various different stakeholders. And this is particularly true because EAPs tend to enroll, or they are meant for people who are not eligible for clinical trials. So they may be further along in the disease, and they could be more, and there may be risks for adverse events and safety concerns. And so we want to have a good level of oversight and stringent supervision. At the same time, we want to sort of reduce the outcomes, visits, all of those things. So there are a number of considerations while selecting, while deciding whether we should incorporate an EAP in the drug development scheme or not overall. And there's no one easy answer, and it may actually vary from drug to drug and the case scenario. We can go to the next slide. But what does FDA say about EAPs? So in addition to just pure access to experimental therapeutics, FDA has a guidance statement that came out in 2019 that specifically guides industry to think about EAPs, to collect data, long-term safety data, but also to collect generalizable safety as well as efficacy data. And this is actually pulled directly from the FDA guidance statement from 2019, if anyone's interested in reading the guidance statement. And I've also listed the page numbers where you can actually find these statements in the guidance statement. We can go to the next slide. So the important consideration for any EAP while we think about launching that is that the FDA provides very clear guidance that providing access to an experimental drug through an EAP pathway should not interfere with clinical trial development, because clinical trial development is the one that's actually going to ultimately get us the market approval, FDA approvals for it to become standard of care, not only for participants who could potentially get access to the drug immediately, but for probably many, many years to come. And many ALS patients could get access once it is FDA approved. So that's the most important consideration, that this should be a mutually exclusive segment of disease population who are not eligible for clinical trials. That's the most important takeaway here. You can go to the next slide. With that, let's talk about some specific study updates. In particular, we'll talk about 2 studies that were NIH funded last year to the MGH HEALEY Center. One is the Pridopidine EAP, and the other is the regulatory T cell from Rapa Therapeutics. You can go to the next slide. The first one is Pridopidine. If any of you are interested in learning more about the EAP, there's a QR code. Feel free to take a picture of the QR code. There's also the clinicaltrials.gov number that's listed on here. So essentially, this is an expanded access protocol that provides access to the experimental therapeutic called Pridopidine to about 200 ALS participants, individuals across 45 sites all over the US. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, and these 200 participants must not qualify for traditional clinical trials. It's that mutually exclusive segment that we were talking about. And because this is an extension of clinical care, EAPs is a paradigm of extension of clinical care, even though it's research, it is important that these individuals are established at a specialized ALS center, because that's the only way for us to make sure that they have good oversight for safety while adding flexibility for many remote outcomes and less frequent visits and blood draws and so on and so forth. And the drug that is being tested in this EAP is being offered in this EAP was already tested in the HEALEY ALS platform trial under regimen D, and it showed some signals of benefit on speech outcomes. And the dose that is being tested in the EAP is exactly the same dose as in the platform trial, which is 45 milligrams twice daily taken orally. And the further information about the inclusion-exclusion criteria and the study outcomes are available on ct.gov. And you can also reach out to any of us, and we're happy at the HEALEY Center, and we're happy to provide more information for you. You can go to the next slide. And this is a map of where the study is being launched or is activated. Everything in yellow are activated sites for the Pridopidine EAP, and in blue are sites that are in startup currently. So out of the 45 sites, this study was awarded by the NIH last September, and nearly 15 sites have been activated, and 9 more sites are very close to activation. And 54 participants have already enrolled in the study, and 5 are in screening as of yesterday, as of September 10th data cut. And this is a continuously evolving number. It changes on a day-to-day basis, and we're keeping a close eye on all the recruitment across many different sites. Our hope is for all sites to be activated and every site to have an opportunity to enroll participants at their site. We also don't want to restrict participation and wait for sites to get activated, because we know that time is the of essence for ALS participants and ALS individuals. So enrollment is on an ongoing rolling basis. So all active sites are able to enroll participants on a rolling basis. You can go to the next slide. And this is another snapshot of what the study progress has been so far. So this is just to provide a timeline. So September 2023 is when the grant was awarded, and our teams, our coordination center, central teams that I showed you a picture of earlier, have been working tirelessly to get the study activated across multiple sites. And under 6 months from the award period, the first participant was enrolled. And from March 2024, when the first participant was enrolled, to within 6 months from that point onwards, 45 participants have enrolled. So there's a lot of interest, which is wonderful. And all the sites have been working very hard as well to get their sites activated for this study. And every participant gets a 2-year treatment on Pridopidine, experimental Pridopidine, and that puts us at Q1 of 2027 for completion of the last participant's last visit, for all the treatment period to be completed, and after that there will be data analyses. We can go to the next slide. When we talk about multicenter EAPs, a question often comes up: why does it take so long? What goes into launching an EAP? And it is important we don't think about all the things that actually happen on the back end to actually start up a study at various different sites. And multicenter EAPs are complex. They're operationally very complex. We have to make sure that every site that's participating follows the same standard protocol. They're all trained, everybody's on the same page, and everything is conducted in the same exact way, and all the data that is collected is all standardized and the data is clean and verifiable, and it's all entered into an electronic data capture system because that's what it will be ultimately used for data analysis towards the end of the study. So a lot of background work happens for study startup, both at the central coordination center as well as at each of the sites. And this is a cartoon that actually shows some of the components that go into this in terms of selecting the sites, to setting up the study and the study monitoring, contracting with various different vendors who may be involved with the labs or the clinical outcomes. For example, there's a speech outcome that is collected through a smartphone app in this particular study, and that's a vendor that we have to contract with, and then go through a central IRB submissions, and also then work with each of the local IRBs to make sure that they are in agreement with ceding their review to the central IRB and develop the electronic database for where the data would be ultimately captured and entered, and then work with each of the sites to work with their contracts team and train their study staff and work with their IRBs, collect all the regulatory documents, because this is still research and there's a protocol, and we are still answerable to FDA in terms of safety oversight and adverse events and all the other reporting requirements. And once all of these things are met, then a study is officially activated and they're able to then bring their first participant in for enrollment. We can go to the next slide. And so what does this compare to other trials overall? And we've been talking about how EAPs are being run like clinical trials, which means that the complexity is similar to clinical trials, and the timelines could also, we need to compare to trials to see where we stand. So this is actually from published data about non-cancer clinical trials and how Pridopidine EAP actually fares compared to what's published. So the total startup period from the funding period to the first participant first visit, the average startup time is around 7 months for multi-site trials. And in comparison, Pridopidine EAP, we were able to start within 6 months. And from funding to the first IRB submission, it typically takes about 3 months for most multi-site trials. And the Pridopidine EAP, again, we worked very, very hard to get this moving very fast because we understand the urgency, and it was about 1 month. From IRB submission to approval, again, generally it's about 2 months. For the Pridopidine EAP, it was about 1 month. And this is a list of all the things that impact the startup timelines at various different levels. You can go to the next slide. Rapa, on the other hand, is a cell-based therapy. It is an exciting cell-based therapy, and this is more operationally complex because this involves. There's a separate webinar on Rapa EAP that was recorded and it's available on our website if anybody's interested in learning about the science of this or the experimental therapy itself. And this involves extracting certain types of cells from an ALS patient through a process called apheresis, and the cells are regulatory T cells, and then these are then processed and expanded and then infused back into the ALS participant. And cell-based therapies are an exciting area of research, specialty therapeutics in neurology as well as in other disease conditions. And this is run at 10 sites for this particular EAP, and we're targeting 40 ALS participants. Again, the fundamental requirement is that they do not qualify for clinical trials at the enrolling site, and because it's an extension of clinical care, they should have established care at a specialized ALS center. And for this to be mutually exclusive with the planned phase 2-3 study, the vital capacity of these participants should be less than 50% predicted. So there's more advanced disease. And this involves 4 infusions given every 6 weeks, followed by 2-year safety monitoring. We can go to the next slide. And so far, 6 out of the 10 sites have their clinical trial agreement signed. 6 out of the 10 sites have IRB approvals. 8 participants have already enrolled, and enrollment is moving as expected and actually much better than what we had anticipated for both of these studies, Pridopidine EAP as well as the Rapa EAP, which is all very, very exciting. You go to the next slide. And I think this is my last slide. If anybody has questions or comments, please feel free to email me. Let's look at some of the Q&A and in the chat box as well. So there is one question about if you participate in an EAP trial, would that preclude you from a clinical trial or another potential medication? The answer is no, but you cannot participate in two investigational studies at the same time unless the both investigational studies would allow you to participate in multiple investigational studies. Majority of clinical trials will say, or EAPs will say, that you cannot be in two different experimental studies at the same time. If you need to then, once you've participated in an EAP and you've completed your participation, you want to participate in another trial or an EAP, you have to wash out of this particular drug before you enter into another study. Another question is, do you know how many ALS drugs are in phase 3 right now and when the next FDA approval may happen? Now, this is a moving target. And so there are a number of studies that are somewhere in development and moving towards the phase 2, phase 3. And also the definitions of phase 1, 2, and 3 are also sort of are evolving. Some of the studies are designed as a combined phase 2/3. There's one study, for example, the FUS ASO EAP that is designed as an all-in-one study, phase 1 to 3, all in one protocol. And so this is a changing number, and it's difficult to predict when the next FDA approval would be, but everybody has the same common goal of developing therapeutics that we can bring to the ALS population as soon as possible. And then regimen D, this means that Pridopidine did not fully pass phase 3. No, Pridopidine was tested in the HEALEY ALS platform trial, which is a phase 2 trial. And so the company is developing the drug further for in ALS space and is designing the next trial as a confirmatory trial. FDA requires 2 clinical efficacy trials to approve any drug. And so it has completed 1 clinical efficacy study, which is the regimen D of HEALEY ALS platform trial. And there are other comments in the chat, and I know we have 4 minutes left. So
I can kind of summarize them. They both came in via email. I think at least one person who sent the email is on the call, hopefully still on the call. So one of the questions that came in via email, they're related, so maybe we can 2 for 1 with them, but we're at a point where there are multiple EAP opportunities. So people are asking if you're in a position where you're weighing multiple EAP options, how does a provider or clinician determine which option might be best suited for that person? Or, you know, specifically if someone's weighing, say, Pridopidine versus CNM as 2 options available, what should somebody do to try to tease apart which opportunity might be best for them?
that's a great question. You know, there are 2 different aspects to this. One is a scientific aspect to this, and one is the logistical aspect to this. And I think from a scientific aspect, both of these are really, they're backed by solid science and some data from prior studies as well. So you wouldn't be wrong if you were to choose either of these studies. And then the logistical aspect is what ultimately sort of determines what would be a better fit for any participant. And so the logistical aspect really boils down to what are the inclusion-exclusion criteria for each of these, and do you meet all the inclusion and exclusion criteria for both of these studies? And if you do, then what does it involve for one versus the other in terms of the number of visits and the outcomes and travel and all of those things. So I think the best thing would be to consult with your neurologist and to figure out what might be a best fit for you in terms of participating. If you have more than one option, that's somewhat a good problem to have in many ways, that we have multiple options. What does washout mean? Yes, so washout typically means that every drug will have a certain what we call as a half-life. So it takes X number of days, hours, or weeks for it to be completely eliminated from your body after the last dose of that medication or experimental drug. So typically it's about 5 half-lives is what most investigational studies would require, or they'll say 30 days, whichever is longer. Some of them may have half-lives of 10 hours, 12 hours, and others may have a half-life of 30 days. Or so we have to wait for times 5 of that in order to enter into another study and get access to a different drug. And the reason for that is there could be some delayed side effects of some of the experimental medications. And let's say that you come off of one of the expanded access protocols today, and then you enter another trial tomorrow. That drug from the previous expanded access protocol may still be in your body, and there potentially could be interactions with the other drug that you're likely to start in the other trial. And maybe there's some crosstalk between the two drugs, and maybe there are some delayed side effects. And it may seem as if that second drug that you're entering into is actually causing some of the side effects, when in fact the side effects could be related to the previous exposure that from the EAP that you just came out of. So that's the washout requirement, and that's almost a standard requirement for almost every investigational study as such. This is great, and I think that brings us to the end of this webinar, and it's always a pleasure to present all the updates about EAPs, and there's a lot of information on the EAP webpage, as Catherine kindly has pasted in the chat box. So feel free to visit the webpage for more information, and we're always here to help and assist you if you have any specific questions for us. And thank you so much for your time.
And I'll add, so for the next webinar, so this of course is the EAP webinar on the second Thursday of the month. So not next Thursday, but the Thursday after that, on the fourth Thursday of the month, we'll be doing a full-fledged platform trial dedicated update specifically about the platform trial. So for those of you who had questions about future plans, hopefully we will see you at the webinar on September 26th, same time, same place.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, take care.